Professor, if you feel that you need a break at any time, just ask, won't you?
Thank you, Sir Brian. I will. Before we start, could I just clarify what we were discussing at the end of the last session? We were discussing my involvement as the clinician in choice of one treatment product over another. And I've stated in my written statement that I would always discuss this with my co-director, initially Dr. MacDonald, thereafter Dr. Walker, and we would both discuss with Dr. Davison, who ran the blood products laboratory and would have to do the ordering. And I would like to just add to that I cannot recall any disagreement between us on choice of one product over another.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Lowe, there are a couple of points in your statement I wanted to ask you about before we leave issues about products and treatment policies. In your statement at paragraph 8.5.2.7, which is page 21, I can put it up on screen. It's WITN 3496013. Please, Seamus. Page 21. Thank you. We can see in the top paragraph, about 6 or 7 lines down, and you're talking here about the 70s, you say that Drs. Prentice, Forbes, MacDonald and Davidson had written protocols for assessment and management, updated regularly, including the type of product and usual calculated dose for each patient, duplicated in the blood bank from which the product had to be requested, etc., etc. Can I just ask you to explain a little more about what these written protocols were? Were they patient-specific protocols, individual to each patient, or were they broader protocols for the treatment of different categories of patient?
I think there were 2 separate protocols. So every junior doctor who was involved on Ward 3 with managing patients who came up to the centre, they were all given, and these were updated annually, I think, a written protocol about general assessment and management. So what the doctor had to do, they gave broad advice as to what would be the usual product, for example, a patient with severe haemophilia A, severe haemophilia B, mild, etc. And then there was a separate indication in each patient's case record as for that individual patient, what was the type of product currently being issued to the patient and the usual calculated dose. And that again would be updated in the event of any change of treatment. And this information was duplicated in the blood bank, and as it says in the statement, the junior doctor, or indeed the doctor on the centre, would have to request by telephone that, and that the blood bank, they would always check that, yes, that was it, prepare it and deliver it.
So in principle, at least, the patient-specific document should still exist in the patient records, if the records survive from the 70s.
Well, it did change over time. So rather than look at the record, I think I said to you that we had for each patient a kind of thin folder which gave the diagnosis, the basic details of the patient, and on that it would be written at that time what that product was. But if the product changed, that would be changed in that folder. There's no point in looking at a stack of case records to find that out. That was written on the patient's, I think what we called it was a pink folder, and that contained a few sheets summarizing the information for the patient. And that had to be available at the centre at all times in case the current case records would have gone off to some other part of the hospital.
And would the pink sheet or whatever document it was for the individual patient say anything more than Mr. X currently receiving factor VIII concentrate, PFC, X number of units? Or would there be some more detailed description?
I think it would say the product and the usual dose.
Okay. And then in terms of the more general document that you've described, which might say the kind of treatments that should be provided, say, to a patient with severe haemophilia B, where were those documents kept? You said they were given to the junior doctors, but were they actually given to the junior doctors to take away, or were they documents that were kept on the centre, on wards 2 and 3, or somewhere else?
I think they were duplicated and copies given to each of the junior doctors. So, for example, the junior doctor, the JHO, who was on the ward and probably the first contact with the patient, would have these. And then the middle grade doctors who would be involved in the cover of the haemophilia centre.
We haven't seen these documents, which is why I'm having to ask you about it, and I appreciate it's a long time ago, but can you recall if these more general documents would have said anything about the kind of information that should be provided to patients if a patient with a particular condition is going to be given a particular type of product? Would it advise the junior doctor what information might need to be provided by way of pros and cons and risks and benefits to the patient?
No, it wouldn't go into that level of detail, because any change of product would have been, discussed with the patient by the consultant, and that was just recording what that choice was.
And then, separate topic, but still just picking up on something about products that in your statement. If we look at paragraph 8.5.2.3, so I think that's 2 pages earlier, please, Shomik. Last sentence in paragraph 8.5.2.3, so it's towards the bottom of the page, thank you. You're talking about work undertaken by Drs. Davidson and Walker, and you say from 1980 they also investigated the potential use of freeze-dried SNBTS cryoprecipitate with the centre. And then if we just go to one further paragraph before I ask you about this, it's paragraph 17.4, page 51, please, Shomik. Paragraph 17.4 towards the bottom of the page. You say the centre evaluated freeze-dried cryoprecipitate as a smaller pool alternative treatment to factor concentrates. And then you say you recall it was not progressed because of the risk of severe anaphylactic reactions, which precluded home treatment on safety grounds, and as SNBTS prioritised factor 8 concentrates, etc. Do you have any direct knowledge yourself of the investigations and work that was being undertaken, I think, around the early 1980s, into the possibility of producing freeze-dried cryoprecipitate? Or is this based on materials you've read later?
This is me just outlining the history of the unit and who was doing what in terms of developments at the time. The paper number 17 I have read and I have referenced, and it was basically just a first stage trial of the product. I think only one infusion was given to a number of patients, and then the recovery of the product in terms of a rise in factor 8 level was evaluated, but it never progressed into more formal clinical trials. It's just outlining its potential, but my impression, I think it is discussed in the Penrose inquiry about the development of products, was this was a product produced by the West of Scotland branch of SNBTS, and they thought it was a good idea, but at the top level of SNBTS it was decided no, because we're now totally concentrating on the development of more pure factor 8 concentrates, lower risk of reactions, and they were working at that time, as you know, on viral inactivation by heat treatment.
Okay, so just for the benefit of others, the paper you've referenced, for the benefit of those listening, I will just briefly put it up on screen. WITN 4035008, please. we'll just look at the summary. On the top of the page, freeze-dried cryoprecipitate was used in the treatment of 14 patients with haemophilia A. The in vivo recovery was 91.2%, which is comparable to that reported from other parts of Europe. The product was efficacious and no adverse effects were reported. Freeze-dried cryoprecipitate is the high-yield product of a low-technology process and as such may be of value in reducing any possible shortfall in the factor VIII requirements of the haemophiliac population of the UK. You say in your statement, Professor, that you think that it wasn't taken any further because of the risk of severe anaphylactic reactions. The documentation the inquiry's seen suggests that in fact, the investigation came to a halt because of the closure of the freeze-drying plant at Lowe Hospital. Do you yourself have any direct knowledge one way or another about it?
No, because I wasn't involved at all in the development or use of this product. I think as I say, all I've read is the paper, and there's some discussion in the Penrose inquiry. That's all I know.
I want to move on to ask you about...
Just before
yes.
you do, this paper is 1983. Your understanding is that it was from 1980 that the possibility of freeze-dried concentrates was being investigated. At what time, looking at what you say in paragraph 17.4, if we can have that back up, please, Shumik. With the statement, thank you, 3496013.
Page 51. 51.
So the suggestion you appeared to be making was that one of the reasons for not going any further with something which had been begun in 1980, and we've seen the conclusion reached on a report in 1983, which suggests that the material for the report must have been available at least some time prior to the publication. That SNBTS was prioritizing factor VIII concentrates, which had a lower risk of reactions and could be virally inactivated by heat treatment. So is it your recollection or is it your view of the history that SNBTS were working on heat treatment in 1981-82?
Thank you, Sir Brian. I think there's a whole volume of the Penrose Inquiry report which discusses the progressive development of these products by SNBTS. It's very complicated, and I think that the heat treatment progressed in stages. I've no direct knowledge of that. I was never involved, and I suggest you could ask SNBTS about the history of development.
It was just to find out if you had any knowledge of your own as opposed to that which you've derived from as it were, third-party sources. But thank you very much.
We can take the statement down. Thank you, Shumik. Professor Lowe, I wanted to ask you next about non-A, non-B hepatitis. In terms of your familiarising yourself with keeping up to date with information and developments in the medical and scientific world, you've said in your statement that in the 70s your sources were literature, but also updates from Doctors Prentice and Forbes. Is that right?
That's correct.
And typically, what medical literature would you be reading in the 70s and 80s?
I think from the 70s it would be the British Medical Journal, at least from the late 70s. I remember subscribing to that. And then when I became a lecturer in 1978, I think that's when I took out my subscription to The Lancet. So those were the two main general medical journals that I read. I would like to add that in 1975, at a time when Doctors Forbes and Prentice suggested I learn a bit more about haemophilia because it was my turn to come on the 6-monthly slot. They registered me for a conference in Glasgow, and I think at that, I have the program here. This is a document that may be available to the inquiry. So it's Royal College of Physicians of Surgeons of Glasgow, 19th September 1975, and it has a reference number of SNB.001.6951. And I remember this meeting very clearly, and it does include, I think, one of the early descriptions of non-A, non-B hepatitis. Would you like me to talk about that?
Well, I'm slightly handicapped in not having the document, Professor, so maybe we can arrange for you to provide a copy of that, or we can obtain it overnight and perhaps ask you specifically about that document tomorrow.
Could I just say that I think that would be the first date that I heard it discussed, because one of the speakers at this meeting was Dr. Krask, whom you know well, who was the UK HCDO Hepatitis Working Party chairman, I think. And he discusses virus hepatitis complicating replacement therapy. And from memory, he was reporting on one of the first outbreaks of that following the very early use of concentrate. And I remember him saying that it wasn't only hepatitis B. You could get hepatitis from non-A, non-B. And I think that was the first time I heard about that. And obviously that was then, I think you've got a fairly voluminous literature which you've circulated about the development from about that year. So I do remember Dr. Krask talking about that.
And more generally, what was the system, if any, or what were the means by which junior doctors such as yourself could, in the 70s and early 80s, receive or obtain information about medical and scientific developments, other than through reading the BMJ or the Lancet or similar periodicals?
Well, I had a pretty intensive day at this meeting hearing about all the developments in haemophilia, and the program which I have in front of me was very detailed. Want a summary of what we were told, or do you want to stick to the non-A, non-B hepatitis?
I think I may ask you to go back to that once we've got the document before us, because it's easier both for me to ask questions, but for those listening to follow if we can display the document. But I'm just interested more generally. This conference was obviously one means by which you, as a junior doctor, learnt more. Was attendance at such conferences a regular feature, or what were the other ways in which, as a junior at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary in the 70s and early 80s, you would keep up to date or be provided with information?
Well, I have very clear memory of that, because on the 1st of November 1974, when I joined the unit, I met all the consultants. And Dr. Forbes took me aside and said, right, just to let you know, I'm the consultant on the unit who is on the Education Committee of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow. He said, you've come to the right place, because this is the best place for any junior doctor to keep updated on what we now call continuing medical education. And he said, right, you're the Registrar in General Medicine. I would advise you to join the college, keep up to date with all of these programs, which are more or less weekly going on at the college. There's preparation courses for the MRCP. Now you've just got that. You don't need that. This is more about updates on the various specialties within general medicine. And he said, you should go to all of those that will extend your knowledge of general medicine, because this is a unique college. It represents physicians and surgeons and dentists, and there are regular updates on all that a trainee doctor needs to know. So he said, think of the major specialties that your knowledge needs updating on, and go to them all. So that was on day one. And then I think it was almost exactly a year later, he said, oh, here's one on haemophilia. This is one you must go to. So Firstly, within the Department of Medicine, I've mentioned that we had several specialties that covered a broad range. There was a weekly meeting where people would present patients and talk about developments in their specialty. So that was at the unit level. There were also weekly general meetings in the Royal Infirmary where all the specialties took it in turn to give an update, often with a patient demonstration. So Glasgow Royal Infirmary, and more generally the college in Glasgow for the west of Scotland, was the kind of epicenter of keeping doctors up to date, and it was very good.
In terms of materials produced either by one of the working parties of UK HCDO, such as the Hepatitis Working Party, or the minutes produced of reference centre directors' meetings, we've heard from other clinicians, other directors, non-reference centre directors, that they weren't routinely disseminated more widely. Can you recall whether in the 70s or 80s, Dr. Forbes, who of course was effectively a reference centre director, did he share with you and your colleagues documents from the reference centre meetings or the working party meetings?
No, I don't think it would be appropriate for them to disseminate boring 20-minutes of meetings. That was internal debate to try and unify and coordinate haemophilia care, as in any other specialty. I think what they were very good at doing was, after the ward rounds, we would all congregate in the coffee room. And then not only Dr. Forbes and Dr. Prentice talking about developments in haemophilia, but all the specialties were represented there. And they would often informally say, oh, the latest news is, and they would give us an update. So on an almost daily basis, you were getting new information. And then, as I say, when you were going to do a slot in a particular specialty, they would send you to a meeting at which local, national, and sometimes international speakers would give you the state of the art. So I think there was a whole network of continued communication. But in haemophilia, they would, I think, just summarize any important developments rather than throw minutes at you.
Now, in terms of non-A, non-B hepatitis specifically, you've said in your statement, in part by reference to what's set out in the Penrose report, that your understanding was that non-A, non-B hepatitis was, and I'm talking here about the second half of the 70s, early 80s, a chronic but mild condition. Is that correct? That was your thinking at the time?
Well, could I say at the start, the unit always talked about hepatitis. I think I described to the Penrose inquiry, when I first arrived on the haemophilia unit, I thought, there's a big sign on the wall saying hepatitis. And it doesn't say hepatitis B or non-B. It just says hepatitis. And I think as medical students, we were all taught that. You have, I think, circulated a 1964 Scottish Home and Health Department memo to all doctors talking about blood transfusion, blood products, where they are at the different centres, including the haemophilia centres and including the haemophilia products. And it talks very plainly about the adverse effects. Number one is the most serious complication is serum hepatitis or jaundice. And that's because the prevalence is thought to be about 1 in 200 of the general population of Scotland and blood donors. So all blood and blood products are going to carry a risk of hepatitis. Now, this was before hepatitis B was discovered, but I think it was fairly rapidly realized once hepatitis B was identified that for every case of jaundice, maybe for every 2 cases of jaundice, 1 would be hepatitis B and 1 wouldn't be, and that was non-A, non-B. So although the terminology may have changed, I think the general feeling was that there is hepatitis and not only hepatitis B. And my recollection is that's what patients were told. There's a risk of hepatitis. It doesn't matter if it's B or whatever.
Now, you weren't, I know seeing very many patients with haemophilia in the period 1978 to 1984. So I don't know whether non-A, non-B hepatitis as a discrete issue was in the forefront of your mind at all. But you've listed in your statement a number of papers, in particular from the early 1980s through to 1985. You don't mention in that Professor Preston's 1978 Sheffield study, which other clinicians have identified as significant in their developing knowledge. Do you know whether you read it at the time and were aware of it at the time?
I trying to remember what journal it was published in.
The Lancet.
And that was 1978.
1978, yes.
Well, it depends if I took out my subscription in any particular month in 1978. I think that the first time I heard about it was, in fact, the second Glasgow College symposium that Dr. Forbes organised, which was in 1980.
Which is
I think that was presented and discussed there. I do have the book.
Yes, I'm going to ask you about that next, in fact, so we can perhaps move straight to that. It's RLIT 301242, please. Shomek. So we can see this is the publication that arose out of the conference, as I understand it, Unresolved Problems in Haemophilia, edited by Dr. Forbes and by you. If we go over 2 pages, please, Shomek. We can see it's described there as being proceedings of an international symposium held at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, Glasgow, September 1980. And then if we go over another 2 pages, please, to the list of contents, we can see liver disease and haemophilia is the first topic of discussion, and a number of papers there referenced. And then we can see it goes on to discuss therapy for haemophilia. And if we go over the page, a number of other issues were then discussed at the symposium. Could we go to the next page, please, Shomek, the foreword? And see what's written here. So this is a foreword which has your name and Dr. Forbes' name at the bottom. And we can see, picking it up in the third line, the purpose of the meeting was to highlight the growing areas of haemophilia care and research as they serve as a model for the study of other disorders. In particular, a major section of these proceedings is devoted to the investigation of liver disease in haemophilia, an area which offers unique opportunities for both basic, applied and clinical research. And then it goes on to set out what the various other sections of the symposium was. What was your involvement, first of all, in the organisation of the symposium, Professor Lowe?
Well, none at all. This 1980 was a complicated year for me, and I'll explain. So in February, I had a very painful episode of a slipped lumbar disc and required to lie flat on my back for a few months. I then gradually mobilized, had a relapse about April, and was referred for a surgical laminectomy, which I think was performed about July. And my colleagues visited to sympathize with me, including Dr. Forbes. And I think it was probably after my operation in August, when I was still having bed rest and convalescence, he brought me around proofs that he'd received. He organized it, of the papers, and he said, could you do some proofreading for me? Because I'm busy organizing this symposium. If you could read the proofs and make any proof corrections, a technical thing. He said this would also be another CME, continuing medical education update for you on haemophilia. So I did that, and I read the papers. I didn't attend the meeting, which was, I think, at the end of September, for the very good reason that I was on honeymoon in the Lake District with my wife. So I didn't go to the meeting. and all I did was the proof correction of the papers. And obviously, once the book was published, I think a year later, I read through it and saw the discussion. I don't recollect being involved in preparation of the foreword, and I think it was very kind for Dr. Forbes to say that I was the co-editor, because I had no role in organizing the meeting. I did proofreading of the papers. It was valuable education for me, but that was my involvement. Dr. Forbes, I think, was just very kind to his juniors and trying to get them their names on publications.
I'm just going to invite you to look with me at a few extracts from it, Professor, not least because this isn't material that we've looked at in any of the oral hearings so far. So, Shemik, if we go on, please, probably 4 pages. That's it, opening remarks. So we can pick up here opening remarks by R.N.M. McSween, and then we can pick it up in the second and third paragraphs, where it said in terms, it was anticipated that the screening of blood donors for Hep B would substantially reduce the incidence of post-transfusion hepatitis. However, this was not the course of events, and while some reduction did occur, post-transfusion hepatitis remained and remains a significant clinical hazard. It's now established that there are other transmissible agents capable of causing post-transfusion hepatitis. There is good evidence that more than one virus is involved in what has become defined as non-A, non-B hepatitis. And then it says this, of particular interest has been the discovery that non-A, non-B hepatitis is a hazard in haemophilia patients, and as you will hear this afternoon, has been particularly associated with the use of the various concentrates with which these patients are now managed. Thus, while the use of these concentrates has represented a major advance in the therapy of haemophilia, it is unfortunate for the patients that this may be accompanied by an increased risk of acute and possibly chronic liver disease. So we have that, and then I think the first paper is a paper by Dr. Krask. If we move on 2 pages, please, Shomek. We can see epidemiology of factor 8 and 9 associated hepatitis in the UK and its Public Health Laboratory Withington, which is Dr. Krask. We won't look at all of it, obviously, but if we could move on 5 pages, Shomek. Just want to... if we go back a page, sorry. Pagination's not very clear on the copy I have. That's it. So we can see under non-A, non-B hepatitis, Dr. Krask says the acute illness is clinically mild, and he refers to the incubation period, saying it's clinically indistinguishable from hepatitis A and B. And then if we go 2 pages further on, please, Shomek. We can see under the heading complications that is discussion of non-A, non-B hepatitis. Again, I think Professor Lowe talking about the acute stage there. So most cases of non-A, non-B hepatitis are mild illnesses. 6 have been reported as severe. 2 patients have died in the acute stages, but there were complicating factors in both cases. And then he goes on to talk about acute fulminating hepatitis. And then he turns to consider chronic liver disease. So if we look at the bottom half of the page, please, Shomek. If we pick it up in the 3rd line, after he says most of the patients are symptomless, he says a few have clinical features suggestive of chronic liver disease. And then he talks about the ethical problems associated with liver biopsy. About 40 patients have undergone biopsy in the UK. Approximately 50% of these have histological evidence of chronic persistent hepatitis. Other patients showed evidence of chronic liver disease or cirrhosis. He talks about the lack of correlation between the histological changes and the degree of disturbance of the serum enzyme levels. The only common factor was regular treatment with factor 8. And then he says 2 lines further down, it seems likely that some patients will develop severe chronic liver disease over the next 10 years. Professor, would you... I don't know whether you've reread this recently, but would you agree, if you have, that in terms of both what Dr. Krask says and what Dr. Howard Thomas goes on to say in later papers, one of the themes is that this is going to be something that is potentially going to be highly problematic in years to come for patients. That was one of the key messages of this symposium, was it not?
Yes, indeed. And so I have been reading these. Could I maybe ask you to go to page 27 of the book?
Is that the internal pagination that you have there?
Yes, it is.
Is that Dr. Thomas's presentation?
That's correct.
Yeah, I think it's page 33, probably, Shomik.
So round about the middle of the first paragraph, I was interested in this sentence. That's fine. The prevalence of abnormalities was similar in patients who had received NHS concentrate only, 100%, and those who had received commercial factor VIII preparations, 96%, but slightly lower in those who had received cryoprecipitate, only 80%. Untreated patients, a few had normal liver function tests. And I was looking back at the previous publications from the Royal Free Hospital, and I think it was 1976, Dr. Levine from Worcester, Massachusetts, and Dr. Catherine Dormandy at the Royal Free Hospital did a combined study of American and London patients. And in 1976, when only cryoprecipitate was used at the Royal Free, 50% of patients had abnormal liver function tests. So first, the comment I'd like to make is that it would seem that before concentrates appeared in Britain, people were getting non-A, non-B hepatitis just from the use of cryoprecipitate or plasma from relatively small pools. And then by 1980, at the time of this symposium, that figure has gone up at the Royal Free from about 50% to 80% in people who receive only cryoprecipitate. And I think the other paper that I've been looking at recently is one from Morfini and colleagues in 1986, and that was a serial study done in Italy. And that was the first study to really look at liver function tests every few weeks following a first treatment, and it went up fairly quickly in those who had concentrate. But basically, in patients who had cryoprecipitate, there was a 100% risk of elevation. It took a bit longer with cryoprecipitate because you're being exposed to a lower pool. So I think in terms of the etiology of this disease, it came to prominence at the time when concentrates were used, but it would seem to me that if you put all this data together, if you have relatively mild haemophilia and are getting only concentrate at fairly long intervals, sooner or later you're going to get hepatitis. I agree that the evidence from the increasing number of biopsy studies was that the pattern was looking gloomy, and I think that Dr. Thomas's prediction is correct. There are going to be some patients who in 10 years' time are going to get the disease. And I think the other page I'd just like to use to finish my comments is that there is discussion on what the book says is page 36, so you probably have to add a couple of pages to that.
Try page 42, Shomik.
Yeah, so just maybe about 6 lines from the bottom. And Dr. Thomas is saying, it is really now a question of how long it takes. Just because we have not seen it in this 6-year period, it does not mean that it will not happen. I think the thinking is that it takes 10 or 20 years or even 30 years for these lesions to progress. I think we have to realize that these are young patients with many years ahead when we are considering the significance of these lesions. And if you could just go on a couple more lines, top of next page. Chronic persistent hepatitis in these patients, from what we know of other groups of such patients, has a much better prognosis, and one would not anticipate that they should come to grief from liver disease. So yes, he is predicting that some patients are going to get liver disease, but it is actually going to take quite a long time. And while we're on that page, and I'm sorry to be lengthy, but could I just make one other point? Because if we turn to, okay, some of these patients will have got it from plasma or cryoprecipitate. The question now is, amongst the concentrates, is there any different risk from the NHS concentrate or the commercial concentrate? And he is saying about line 5, the point is that the advantage accrued by volunteer donations is probably eliminated by having to use a large pool. And then the final sentence of this paragraph, the end result of this is that the risk of the large pool NHS concentrate and the commercial concentrate may be similar. And I'm sorry, if you could just go down to the end of the final paragraph. The other thing I should perhaps like to say is that there's evidence that a small number of haemophiliacs who have come to post-mortem have evidence of having had chronic liver disease, probably contracted years back from long-term exposure, acquired in the years before commercial concentrate was ever thought of, when plasma or cryoprecipitate was used. No one should take away the idea that commercial concentrate is the sole causative agent. We must assume that the large pool NHS concentrate is equally involved. So to summarize all that, I think the literature looking back over the late 70s up until about 1985 was, yes, there's a problem. Is it all due to commercial concentrate? No. If commercial concentrate had never been used and it was NHS concentrate, would the problem still be of the same size? Yes. And you could go further back and say, if concentrate was never invented and we'd carried on treating patients with plasma or cryoprecipitate, the end result would have been the same. Now, I think in terms of practical management, the dilemma for the treaters is, yes, we know there's a problem, but what's the alternative? If you want to treat with concentrate, in general terms, NHS might be preferred for all kinds of reasons, but it's the size of the pool that's probably going to be the main determinant of people getting this infection and ending up with liver disease from it. And while it may be very sensible and was the policy, I think, that my colleagues in Glasgow Infirmary and all the other haemophilia centres in the UK was, if you have mild patients, try and get away for as long as you can with cryoprecipitate or plasma for the haemophilia B patients, because hopefully it's only a matter of time before you can get viral inactivation of the concentrates. So in terms of decisions about choice of product, which I think is something the inquiry is almost certainly wanting to address, is, this, very sadly, this goes back to that 1964 Scottish Home and Health Department message saying 1 in 200 people has a virus that will give you jaundice. And no matter what you get, plasma, cryoprecipitate, concentrate, NHS or commercial, you're going to get it at some time. So what decision do you make in 1980 about changing the treatment for the majority of patients who've got it? Because by this time, we know from these studies such as the Royal Free that just about everybody, regardless of their treatment, has abnormal liver function tests. I think that the discussion, and I'm very sorry I missed it because I was on my honeymoon, between Dr. Thomas and Dr. Krask on these 2 pages is very far-sighted, and I think their predictions are correct, that yes, it's going to be a problem, and I think from memory, we're starting to see evidence of liver disease in our patients at Royal Infirmary by about 1986, from memory. Our colleagues that I mentioned earlier, Dr. Stephen and Dr. Maddock, did a very systematic review of liver function tests over the first half of the 1980s in our patients. And I think there was about a 60% prevalence of abnormal liver function tests. Couldn't be related to previous treatment. But all patients at this time were carefully examined for any clinical signs of liver disease, and none had evidence of that. And then I think it was about a year or so after that paper was published that we saw our first patient who had clinical non-A, non-B hepatitis progressing to cirrhosis, and they probably acquired that in the 1950s from plasma, or in the 1960s from cryoprecipitate. So I think that the prediction was correct. The question is, clearly, what should haemophilia treaters have done? Because this evidence is now emerging when most patients with severe haemophilia, A, have stayed alive, because mortality is now approaching that of a non-haemophiliac, unlike in the era of cryoprecipitate and plasma, when half of patients died before they were 40. And secondly, because there were unquestionable benefits from home treatment. And in the case of the Glasgow patients, I'd refer you to the paper I've quoted by Professor Ivana Markova and her colleagues at the Department of Psychology at Stirling University. And she did a prospective study of the psychosocial benefits to both children at York Hill Hospital and to the adult patients at Glasgow Royal Infirmary, that all of them said it was a life-changing treatment, and only concentrates could do that. So I'm sorry to be lengthy, but I think, yes, I agree with what you're saying, it was a bad disease. The question for the inquiry is, at what time should haemophilia directors have stopped using concentrates, stopped using home treatment, and faced the possibility that patients might start dying again prematurely of bleeding?
Professor Lowe.
May I just?
Yes,
I think what Council was focusing on, although you're right, the other issues do arise, but I think what she was focusing on was how serious a disease it was or wasn't, and what the knowledge about that was. Now, you've told us you agree it was a bad disease, and I take it you're saying it was known to be in 1980. But can I just go back to page 27? That's 0033, Shumik. No, it wasn't that. It was the page we were talking about, the highly problematic in years to come.
It's, I think, sir, it's page...
It's page 36.
Yes, so...
It's 0042, is it?
Try page 42, Shumik.
Thank you. It's my fault in notation. Yes, I just want to understand what, at the bottom of the page, please, what Dr. Thomas was saying in the last couple of sentences, full sentences on the page, and where he says, I think the thinking is that it takes 10 or 20 years, even 30 years, for these lesions to progress. I think we have to realize that these are young patients with many years ahead when we're considering the significance of these lesions. Trying to unpick that, concentrating not so much upon what caused it, but what sort of problem it was. Is he recognizing there that haemophilia is something which most patients who have it are born with, and therefore they're treated fairly early in life?
Um, yes, let me think about this.
And therefore, the argument would go on. I just want to try to see what it conveyed to you. The point he's making may go on to say this is really significant because, in particular, they're young. We can expect them to live 10, 20, 30, or even more years. That's what it says to me at the moment, but that may be a wrong way of reading it, and you'll probably know better than I do on this.
He's saying these are young patients. Yeah, the other issue that was raised, I mean, the problem with these biopsy studies, it's a very selected population of patients. Many haemophilia directors, including Dr. Forbes in Argument, thought it was unethical to biopsy patients with haemophilia because there had been fatalities. And if you look at the I think the Alidort paper in 1985, that is basically the largest and best systematic study of all the biopsy studies, or at least all the studies where people collaborated with reviewing the liver biopsy specimens. So it was American and European studies. The biopsy samples were independently examined by expert histopathologists, a panel of them. They looked at what the original pathologist had said and discovered, not unusually for medical investigations reported in different places by different pathologists, that there is inconsistent grading of the severity. So what they had was the independent adjudication of all the biopsies that were sent to them, which is, from memory, about maybe 90% of all the biopsy studies. And they said, right, we're categorizing them not into some subjective pathologist's viewpoint, but by a panel-agreed series of definitions. And they just said, no liver disease, mild liver disease, or severe liver disease. And basically, the situation was that the instance of severe liver disease, cirrhosis, or really bad looking hepatitis was probably between 12 and 15%. So that's the summary of it. But then you have to consider what is the age of the patient, but more importantly, how long have they been exposed to the agent? So what I'm trying to say, Sir Brian, is that there are many factors to consider when you're looking back over 10 years of biopsy studies in about 1985 to say, well, what was the general message coming through? And the general message is, yes, about something 12 to 15% of these patients are getting a nasty looking disease. But from what we know about the natural history of progression of cirrhosis from alcohol or anything else, it's going to be quite some time before they get the disease. Now, that's a good thing initially, but I agree with you in saying that for a young person, in 10, 20, however many years, there's going to be nasty liver disease. Sorry, I'm trying to generalize from what we know.
Well, I think what my question, if I can just rephrase it, perhaps, it was about what the information was there to be known in 1980 when this symposium took place. And one way of putting it is that he appears that he may well be saying that it's serious, but all the more serious because these patients are young. Is that a fair reading?
It is a fair point.
No, it's not a point. It's a question of what he means to say.
Oh, I see. Right.
That's what I think he may well be saying, and I just want to have your comment on that, if you have one.
It strikes me, just reading, because of the inquiry, all these reports, that there is a spectrum of opinion about what the severity is, what are the number of patients with severe disease, how long, and how long it's going to take. But I think Dr. Thomas makes a very good point in that, as a hepatologist, most of his patients hitherto have been people who've been drinking for many years and are getting old. The young patients with haemophilia have a much higher life expectancy, and I think the point you're make it, well, the interpretation you're looking at here, Sir Brian, is that for a young person, this is bad news. It may take years to happen, but it's going to be bad news, yes.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry I interrupted your line of questioning.
Professor, the question I asked you was about what your actual knowledge was at the time, and what you said in your statement your knowledge and understanding was. And I just, before I go back to that question, check this with you. You've made out what might be regarded as a submission or an argument as to why treating clinicians shouldn't be criticised for not taking a different course. You were not at the time we're talking about, as I understand it, and we're talking here the second half of the 70s, the early part of the 1980s. You were not a clinician taking treatment decisions in relation to what concentrates or products to use for patients with haemophilia, were you?
No, I wasn't.
So if we go back to the question of what you knew in 1980, as someone who we know, because your name is on this and you've told us, read this, you weren't actually at the symposium, but you read the papers beforehand, you read the papers and discussion afterwards. It's clear, isn't it, from what we've looked at, and I haven't taken you further on, but I'm anticipating you've read, there's a discussion then, a presentation by Dr. Preston and Dr. Trigger from Sheffield, and then if we perhaps just pick it up one further section, we go through to, it's probably page 60 or so, Shomik. We go back 2 pages. So this is a discussion that follows the presentation by Dr. Preston, Dr. Trigger and Dr. Underwood, and we can see this halfway down the second half of the page. Dr. Trigger says, we're dealing with chronic liver disease in which 5 to 7 years is a very short time. 10 to 20 years may be a long time. We've been looking at liver biopsies of children under the age of 10 years. What we're concerned with is what's likely to happen to them when they should be fit, healthy 25-year-olds. I was shown in Pittsburgh 2 horrendous cases of 18 and 21-year-olds with large, juicy esophageal varices that the physician just hopes he is in Europe when they burst because he doesn't know what he will do. I think we're just building up trouble. And then Dr. Thomas says, and these are 2 hepatologists, I think our view is the same. If we draw the analogy to hepatitis B infection, many of these patients are infected at birth, at least in Africa. They do not get problems till the 3rd decade of life. One might reasonably justify an analogy to that sort of infection. As Dr. Trigger has said, it is in 10 years' time that we shall see the problems. Bearing in mind the proportion of the patients that are infected or have persistent abnormal liver function tests, anything from 60 to 80%, it will be an enormous problem when it happens. Now, in light of that, and there are other references to similar effect from Dr. Trigger and Dr. Preston and Dr. Thomas, in light of that, on what basis can you say that it was regarded by you or regarded generally at this time as a mild condition, Professor?
Well, in my statement, let me... Sorry, which part of my statement are you referring to?
Well, you say in paragraph, section 30 of your statement, bottom of page 63, it's where it starts. But if we go over the page, Shomik, if we go back to WITN 3496013, and we go to page 64, in paragraph 30.3, you say that your recollection of the evolution of your understanding parallels essentially what's summarised in the Penrose Inquiry Preliminary Report. And then if we go to the next page, please, Shomik, paragraph 30.6, you say, it's bottom of the page, you quote your evidence to the Penrose Inquiry, and you say the general feeling was that over that period of time, very few patients with haemophilia had developed any clinical liver disease, that there were biopsy studies that showed that the changes in the liver tended to be relatively mild. So it was thought to be a chronic but mild condition. And then you refer to various pieces of literature over the page, which, as we've already discussed, doesn't include Professor Preston's report and obviously doesn't include this symposium. So the question really, Professor Lowe, is what was the basis for saying in terms positively it was a mild condition in light of the precisely the kind of concerns that we see expressed in the symposium?
I think so. If you turn to page 66 of my written statement, the evidence I gave was the report, I think, from the UK HCDO that I think Dr. Biggs and then Dr. Ritza were reporting 5 yearly. Treatment of haemophilia 1976 to 1980. It's interesting to know that only 2 deaths were attributed to hepatitis during the 5-year period. The Minucci liver biopsy paper 1982, non-progression was the general theme. The White study, I then quote 1982 again. The frequent exposure to factor VIII concentrates is not accompanied by the development of more severe forms of liver disease. The Stevens et al. Liver biopsy 1983.
It does say, to be fair, for many transfusion requiring haemophiliacs, the frequent exposure.
It does.
So it means that for others it is. That's how I read it.
Okay, and then the Stephen paper, and then the Hay paper 1985, turning the statement from an overstated problem to an understated problem. And then the Alidort study, which I think is the definitive analysis of many of these previous studies. It took some time before a consensus could be reached on the extent of severe liver disease in all these biopsy studies. And then I think the Penrose inquiry report, final report, knowledge of AIDS and hepatitis B concludes, there was no generally accepted view prior to 1985 that non-A, non-B hepatitis had other than a generally benign prognosis, but 1985 was the turning point. This was when information began to emerge that would lead to changing views. And I think this was particularly the Alidort paper, which said, well, it's been a bit, from small studies of biopsies in selected patients, it's a bit uncertain as to what the overall result is. But from 1985, it became increasingly understood that non-A, non-B hepatitis infection could be associated with serious disease. So I'm sorry I've not done a systematic review because I haven't had time to do that, and I've had limited documentation available to me due to COVID lockdown access to papers. But at the time I wrote my written statement in September, this was me trying to give an overview of what the emerging evidence from biopsy studies was.
I think, to be fair, you're being too hard on yourself, Professor, because this is really a question of what one makes of the various studies and the information that I have as to what people thought at the time. I understood what you were saying to me earlier when you told me that you, or told counsel, that you agreed it was a bad disease by reference to her questions about the 1980 symposium. That was your view, your personal view at the time. These papers you're referring to, I think, are probably an attempt to see after the event, perhaps, how the land lies rather than at the time. But let me just ask you about, for instance, about the Stevens paper. They quote Alidort in 1981, where he shows the incidence of chronic active hepatitis and cirrhosis was 16%. Just to put that in context, cirrhosis is generally progressive, is it not?
Yes, it is.
And if it goes on progressing, the ultimate conclusion is that there will have to be a liver transplant because continued cirrhosis is not ultimately compatible with life. Is that correct?
Yes.
And here it is saying that there is a 16% chance. That's about 1 in 6, isn't it, people?
That's correct.
What's your watershed? You have a threshold as to whether that's serious or not? If that out of every 6 people, 1 is suffering from a seriously progressive disease which will end in death or transplant, presumably you'd regard that as serious. But don't let me put words in your mouth. I mean, would you regard that as serious?
So this really comes about by you asking me the question. In your oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry, you stated the general perception was that very few patients were developing chronic liver disease. In retrospect, it might have been better to say we're developing clinical evidence of chronic liver disease.
Yes, I see.
So perhaps at the Penrose inquiry, I didn't do enough homework in reading.
I really wouldn't blame yourself because we here can read. We have our expert group. We can read what the experts tell us, and we can read what the papers say. The issue for me will be a mixture of the degree to which a risk that hepatitis non-A, non-B might be caused by therapy, the degree to which that risk was appreciated, and part of that is an appreciation of the severity of the risk as a risk, not as it seems to me at the moment, but this is a matter for submission, as a matter of conclusion as to whether the risk was properly identified as one or whether it was simply overstated. But there we are. That I think is all argument, and I'm in no position at the moment to conclude the argument one way or the other. I'm just interested in what goes into it in order to be able to determine it properly and fairly in due course, whatever the arguments may be. But your evidence is really, it helps if it's about what you knew at the time, what you thought at the time, what you heard other people saying at the time. That's what really is of assistance to me. So I'm sorry for that, but taking time to tell you that.
I'm sorry, could I just briefly say that I think I did my best in what I think was limited time at the Penrose inquiry to look at the evidence, and then I quote the final report of the Penrose inquiry, which had a very detailed look at the evidence, and try to distill for you what I thought was happening at the time, maybe even in 1980. And then you asked me the question, 3010, do you consider that haemophilia doctors prior to circa 1985 adopted an unreasonable and or over-optimistic view on the long-term risks of NANB hepatitis, given the limited information that was available to them at the time? And my answer was, as I was little involved with haemophilia care between 1978 and 1985, I do not think that I can give an informed opinion on this. It appears from the literature cited above that the long-term risks were evolving. So I think that's in a way what you're trying to ask me. I looked at the literature in 1980 And it appeared to me at that time, in response to your first question, yes, there was increasing evidence from biopsies, but the studies, there was a lot of room for doubt as to what the extent and severity was. And then I'm now looking back at your request to look at this information again. And I would just go back to, there's two important questions here, Sir Brian. There's, what are we knowing about the evolution of the risks? And yes, the predictions are gloomy. Against the liver biopsy study information, there was a lack of clinical evidence of liver disease, and that I think must have been surely the factor which was influencing my colleagues. So when you ask me the question, do you consider that haemophilia doctors prior to Kirk in 1985 adopted an unreasonable and or over-optimistic view, given the limited information available at the time? I'd say two things. It was limited information. They knew that lots of patients had had abnormal liver function tests, but we now know in retrospect, we now know retrospectively that the association of abnormal liver function tests was very misleading. It bore no relationship at all to the severity of the biopsy studies. So it may have been that my predecessors were saying, well, liver function tests got them down a bit, but not that bad, we see alcoholics in Glasgow all the time with these, and, we know it will take years for some of them to develop the disease. But also, my predecessors as haemophilia directors would have had in mind that having seen the enormous benefits of concentrates, people were living longer, perhaps living longer to get cirrhosis, but they were living longer. They're not dying of bleeding. There were enormous psychosocial and family benefits from giving concentrates to home treatment. No matter if a judge says at some point, right, it was 1980, you should have stopped treatment, or 1982 or whatever, that is an awful decision for both patients and families and doctors to make. You're telling me, the patient and parents would say, do I just not take any blood products ever because I might get cirrhosis? And the problem is most of them are already got severe liver disease that's going to progress. And that's it may have been over-optimistic looking at through the retrospectoscope, as one tends to do, particularly 40 years on. But I think the question is, did the haemophilia doctors and their patients at the time make the right decision to carry on looking for the eventuality that viral inactivation of concentrates, which are the accepted standard of haemophilia treatment care worldwide? Your own expert group on treatment of haemophilia says that, it was established by the 1980s that the only way to successfully treat the morbidity and the mortality of haemophilia is appropriate provision rapidly, especially to a young person, of something that will prevent them dying of intracranial bleeding or developing crippling arthritis. It's a very difficult decision to make, and it's not surprising that, to my knowledge, hardly any haemophilia directors in Europe or North America said, right, I believe that Eric Preston's biopsy paper is terrible and therefore will stop treating the patients. That is the difficulty that my predecessors as Haemophilia Centre directors had to cope with. And I'm so glad I wasn't born 5 years earlier, because I don't know what I would have done.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Professor Lowe, the question I was asking you about your actual knowledge at the time, before we leave this symposium, is there anything else about the symposium that you wanted to make an observation about? I think I've shown you the passages I wanted to explore with you.
The unsolved problems in haemophilia book, is that you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah, so other than to repeat that I'm a bit mortified that Dr. Forrest put me down as a co-editor when all I did was alleviate my sore back by reading the proofs. I think it was a great book. And could I say that the first symposium in 1975 was mostly people from Scotland, so that was very useful for people like me. But Dr. Forbes, I think, was the first member of UK HCDO to offer to put on a 2-day meeting as the annual general meeting of UK HCDO and make it, okay, half a day for the business, and let's have a 1.5-day symposium in the Glasgow College, which will be published, which will address all the challenges, the unsolved problems of haemophilia care. And that was the first meeting that led to subsequent UK HCDO meetings every year or two, having not only a scientific symposium, but an open one. It's not just a few boring haemophilia directors. Anybody can register, anybody can come, patients, people in other specialties. And I think that was a great institution. And 20 years after that, in 2000, Professor Walker and I put on a repeat performance saying, can we celebrate 20 years of these symposiums, which have been a great success in advertising the challenges and inviting debate about which they come.
Professor Lowe, you referred a few moments ago to difficult decisions having to be taken by clinician and patient. And I want to focus on the position now of the patient. Would you accept, as a matter of principle, that it's the responsibility of the clinician to inform his or her patient of the risks of treatment?
Correct.
And it's not the responsibility of the patient to find it out for themselves, whether by reading literature or books or anything like that. It's that they're entitled to be told by their treating doctor what the risks and benefits are.
Yes.
Now, do you know if there are any contemporaneous materials from the second half of the 70s or the first half of the 1980s which show what was discussed by clinicians at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary with patients about the risks of hepatitis and in particular non-A, non-B hepatitis?
Well, as I said to the Penrose Inquiry and repeated here, my first exposure to the haemophilia unit was big signs on the wall saying hepatitis that nobody could miss. I think that patients very well knew that there was a risk of getting at least jaundice, which was the initial manifestation of hepatitis. In 1975-76, when I was assisting with putting up the infusions of the patients, up to 4 severe haemophiliacs would ring up in the morning saying, can I come up and have my cryo or plasma or whatever? They would come and sit around and then have 4 packs of cryoprecipitate or whatever put up. And while I was doing that, the patients said, right, be careful, doctor, and don't jab yourself with those needles because we've all had jaundice, you know, and I don't want his jaundice or my jaundice to do that. There was a wide knowledge, at least amongst the frequently attending patients, that jaundice and hepatitis, whatever subtype you want to call it, was a problem. I remember my patients saying, well, he's only had jaundice once. I had it twice because it's 2 different ones, you know. I think the general perception was that hepatitis was a risk. I don't recall that in 1975, Dr. Forbes and Dr. Prentice did anything to anything other than to warn patients of the risk repeatedly. I think it was mentioned in many Haemophilia Society publications, the Bulletin, the Peter Jones booklets, which many patients read living with haemophilia, frequent references to it. And for the Penrose Inquiry, you might remember that we had a collective response. We asked, you know, haemophilia directors from all over Scotland of all different eras, have you any collective recollection of what was told? And what information we had, we would submit. Now, I think you have copies of this. And could I direct you particularly to one of the annexes of that collective response? And we're talking about, going back to 1980, because on a previous visit to me on my bed of pain, in I think about April 1980, Dr. Forbes came round and he said, could I just tell you, as again part of your continuing medical education, we had a very good meeting of the Scottish branch of the Haemophilia Society, and I think that was about March 1980. So independently of the UK Haemophilia Society, there was a very active Scottish branch of the Haemophilia Society. It met every 6 months. And he gave me a copy of the minutes of the meeting. And the speaker had been Dr. Alistair Parker, who was Dr. Ludlam's colleague in 1980. And I think he was treating the patients with haemophilia maybe before or just around the time that Dr. Ludlam arrived to join him in Edinburgh. And he is reporting to the Scottish Haemophilia Society that he's just been to spend some time in Seattle in the United States, and where there was a very active investigation of hepatitis of the type which I think is summarized in this Unsolved Problems book that you see there. And he gave the talk solely on the topic of hepatitis to quite a large group of patients from across the different parts of Scotland. Now, I don't know what he said, but the whole presentation was called Hepatitis, and the minutes record that he gave a very full update on the evolving knowledge about hepatitis internationally. And he was thanked profusely for the talk. And at the end of the meeting, end of the minutes of this meeting, it says date of next meeting. And it was to be this meeting was in Glasgow Royal Infirmary, organised by Dr. Forbes. That's why I had a copy of the minutes. The next meeting was to be held in the autumn in Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, and the newly appointed Dr. Ludlam was going to give a talk on something. And 6 months after that was Dr. Willoughby at York Hill. And I would guess that in 1981, he would almost certainly talk about the benefits of home treatment to his patients, because he'd been giving home treatment, as you know, for about a couple of years. So certainly in Scotland, I think we have evidence that patients were regularly updated on all the developments in haemophilia. And that, I think, is a good example in March 1980, at this time. And you're asking me what information was given to patients. So what I've tried to say to you, Ms. Richards, is two things. Certainly, in my brief involvement with haemophilia care in 1975, the risk of jaundice and hepatitis was the talk of the steamy, as we say in Glasgow. People knew about it. They knew about the risks. That didn't stop them wanting to have the treatment. And then in 1980, the patients who come to Scottish Haemophilia Society meetings on a general education program are told in detail about hepatitis.
Professor Lowe, my question to you was not about what patients might have learnt from talking to each other, or what those who read Peter Jones' book, which was published in 1974 and makes no mention of anything other than hepatitis B for obvious reasons, might have learnt, or what might have been available to patients from other sources, those who attended a particular meeting. Or my question to you was about what information is there to tell this inquiry the advice about non-A, non-B hepatitis and the risks of it that was, as a matter of fact, provided by clinicians at the Royal Infirmary to their patients.
So in addition, as I think I've said in my statement, for this period of time, when I was getting my haemophilia experience, Dr. Forbes or Dr. Prentice, whoever was doing the ward round, would come over and see these patients when they came up for treatment and do the reviews. And one of them would take me in from time to time and take through review, which went, okay, how are you doing? What's new? Any problems since I saw you last? In particular, have you had jaundice? Have you had hepatitis? And then they would, in the examination, examine the liver and the spleen, and they would discuss the treatment and how happy are you about the treatment? And this was long before her home treatment. We just come up and had the treatment. And hepatitis was not something that was hidden. They're being asked about jaundice and hepatitis, and that to me indicated that the patients were being told by their consultant physician about the risks. Whether it was quantified, I don't know, but there was a risk.
So your own factual knowledge is based upon some consultations that you would have sat in on as part of your training in 1975.
Yes.
Where conversations along the lines you've discussed, at which jaundice and the word hepatitis were mentioned. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, you've referred to these warning signs, or the word hepatitis. What was the purpose of that, and where exactly was it displayed?
In the room in which patients came in to speak to the haemophilia doctor or the haemophilia sister. And that was where blood would be taken. And I think that was a general warning to patients and staff.
Would you accept that that's, whilst no doubt a very sensible precaution to have, to put that on the wall, that's not really going to assist individual patients with understanding the risks to them from their treatment as individuals to take an informed decision about what treatment they want, is it?
Well, as I've said, the message from my consultants was, what do you think of your treatment? Are you happy with it? And that would include, I assume, both the benefits and the risks.
You've referred in your statement also to the request forms and laboratory blood samples having yellow dangerous specimen labels on. The purpose of that was to protect staff, however, wasn't it? That's not a means of providing advice to patients to enable them to give informed consent, is it?
It was a request from all the laboratories, and I think it followed the widely publicised hepatitis outbreaks, particularly in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1972. That was the time, and I think you've seen some of these circulars. Take great care in treating patients who have multiple infusions, whether that be in renal transplant units, in liver units, in haemophilia units. Yes, you're right. And when I started, Dr. Forbes took me aside and said, just to take blood off you, Gordon, and check you out for hepatitis B, because all the staff involved in giving treatment to these patients are told, be very careful with disposal of your needles. And as you can see from what I've reported from my conversations with the patients, it was, the 4 patients sitting there with their drips. Doctor, it's the jaundice, and you have to be, and don't prick yourself. It was the talk of the steamy, as we say in Glasgow. It was so widely known, at least amongst the regular patients.
Last question on this topic, Professor, at least for now. Was it in the 70s and first part of the 80s, to your knowledge, the practice of the clinicians at the Royal Infirmary to record any discussions they had with patients about the risks of treatment in the patient's notes?
At the reviews, some were done on when they're in patients, but it's the obvious time to do it. They're in anyway, they're having blood taken anyway. The answer is, I can't remember. On ward rounds, these would be teaching ward rounds. So the consultant is spending some of the time with the patient, talking, some of the time talking to the junior doctors or the students who are accompanying them. And it's my knowledge that it would normally be the junior doctor, like me, who would be writing in the notes reviewed by, sometimes the consultant would write it themselves, and sometimes it would be the junior doctor who would write down what was the consultant's view, opinion, or information to patients.
Okay.
But there wasn't the kind of tick box which you might see now when people wander around with some kind of smart thing and tick boxes saying, I have discussed with patients.
So I'm going to move on to another topic. So I note the time and wonder whether we should pick that up tomorrow
Well,
afternoon.
I'm sure Professor Lowe could do with a break. And we will take a break till 2 o'clock tomorrow, is it?
Yes.
So 2 o'clock tomorrow, if you please, Doctor. I look forward to, Professor, I'm sorry. I look forward to seeing you again at that time. The same rules apply, of course, about what you may say or may not say overnight. 2 o'clock tomorrow.